Good evening, everybody. My name is Melinda Jones. I'm the National President of National Council of Jewish Women of Australia, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Tonight is a special night in many ways. Last night we celebrated the 100th anniversary of National Council of Jewish Women New South Wales. That was an incredible achievement for 100 years ago for women to get together and to form a group that's so powerful it's lasted a whole century and is still going strong. So congratulations to all the women over time. It's also the beginning of NAIDOC Week, and NAIDOC Week is a celebration. It's a celebration of, this year, the elders of Indigenous people. And it's, again, I think, quite important for us to realise that as an organisation, National Council is very keen on appreciating the elders in our community, understanding what the elders have got to offer, to listen to the wisdom of the elders, but of course to embrace the younger people as much as we possibly can. So tonight, I'd like to dedicate this for the elders of the Indigenous people and also of the Jewish community, for our elders. I'd like to introduce you now to Danielle Jones-Resnick, who usually comes in as our Zoom master and hides, and tonight is going to do the acknowledgement of country.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. I am here in Melbourne on the land of the Barrungum and Birri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We'd also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
Thank you, Danielle. I said last night that when National Council of Jewish Women was formed, it was formed to deal with the important issues of our times. And there is no question that the most important issue of our times is the issue of the referendum of the voice to Parliament. This issue is fundamental in the way we perceive ourselves as a people, the way we see ourselves as a nation, the way we're going to walk together. We've got some wonderful women speaking, and I'd like to introduce Amanda Gordon to introduce the speakers. Amanda was part of the Reconciliation Council of New South Wales when it first started, so she's been walking this journey for a long time, and that's something, whenever we join in this process, it's something we want you to bring into your whole person and into your family as something that is important for you as a value. Amanda.
Thank you so much, Melinda, and welcome everyone. I'm speaking to you also from Sydney, from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and delighted to be able to do so and to be able to stand and say that in the way that we began so 30 years ago when I began working with people like Linda Burney and the Mundines and the proud New South Wales men and women who were working so hard for this process. But tonight we are honoured to be speaking to two very important women, starting with a younger woman, Allira Davis. Thank you so much for joining us, Allira. She's a Cobble Cobble woman from the Barrungum and Birri Gubba nations. She's based and was born in Logan, Queensland, and grew up in Beenleigh, which if you're in Brisbane, you would know well. Allira has over 5 years' experience working in the public and private sectors, completing her diploma in government, specialising in project management, working specifically on policies, grants, and managing programs. Allira is currently the youth manager and co-chair alongside Bridget Karma in leading and co-convening the Uluru Youth Dialogue. Allira and Bridget manage and support First Nations young people around the country to inform and educate all Australians on the Uluru Statement from the Heart and providing First Nations youth with the skills and knowledge to make substantive change to the lives of our people and a better future for all. And I've quoted you when I've said lives of our people, but Allira, I think that's true, that it's our people. It's making a contribution for all of us when you're skilled and knowledgeable about yourself and your past and your present and your future. So thank you. Our other speaker this evening is Professor Kim Rubenstein, an Australian legal scholar, legal practitioner, and Professor in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra. A graduate of Melbourne University and Harvard Law School, she is Australia's leading expert on citizenship and has been a public policy contributor through running cases in the High Court of Australia, advising on legislation, a member of the independent committee that reviewed the Australian citizenship test, and through writing books and articles about citizenship law and policy. She is a fellow of the Australian Academy and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. So we have two highly skilled, incredible women to talk to us this evening, and I thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Amanda. Allira, I believe you're to start.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm extremely excited to be here and share a little bit of information about the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the First Nations voice to Parliament and where it came from. I have a couple of slides here, so please bear with me. I had some technical difficulties before, so hopefully everything goes smoothly. Can everyone see my screen? Yep, cool. So yeah, I am, as Amanda said, Allira Davis, I'm proud Cobble Cobble woman from the Barrungum and Birri Gubba Nation. So if you're aware, if you're in Brisbane, it's we are the caretakers of the Bunya Mountains Bunny. Follow the culture of that, and my people were taken from Warra, which is 40 minutes out from Dalby, to the Cherbourg Mission, which is the Barrungum Mission. And then later, my great-grandfather escaped the mission, moved up to Hervey Bay, Fraser Coast, and then my grandfather and grandmother, my grandmother moved down to Logan and grew up in Eagleby, Beenleigh. So she's been in the same housing commission home for about 50 years. I was telling Danielle, Melinda and Kim before, so super proud of them. And yeah, I want to say happy NAIDOC week as well. Yeah, I hope you all learn a little bit about where the First Nations voice came from, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And also shout out to our elders as well. I might have some millennial talk throughout my presentation, but yeah, I think our elders are definitely the caretakers of our culture, and I've always learnt that, you know, you follow your cultural authority, and in this process, and as the youth manager for the Uluru Dialogues, I think it's important that we continue to uphold and uplift our elders, because they're the ones that have all the knowledge, and our culture's that verbal information sharing as well. So one of our co-chairs, Auntie Pat Anderson, as you may know her, she, I think, won Elder of the Year last year or the year before, the Lifetime Achievement Award, NAIDOC Award. And yeah, just being in her presence every single, nearly every single day, is just, I'm always in awe of her leadership and her resilience as well. And we've got to push this yes vote, to make sure that, you know, our elders who have passed on to, we can just keep fighting the good fight, and hopefully, and I think we will get a First Nations voice enshrined into the Constitution, because I have a lot of hope for this. But yeah, I want to acknowledge the country that I'm on today. I'm actually on Yugambeh country, in Logan, Queensland. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge the ancestral spirits of our First Nations people who created the boundaries, waterways, lands, boundaries, waterways, and lands, which allow safe passage throughout our country for visitors. I would also like to acknowledge any other your elders as well. I think you're right, Amanda. I always say, you know, if you were born in Australia, it is our culture is your culture too. And I think this process and this gift to the Australian people to walk with us for a better future is very powerful and empowering for all Australians. So here's just a bit about what I'll talk about. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, the Uluru Youth Dialogue. I think I should probably mention what we do for my work. I do love my job. I love working with young people, and I love, impacting change in community, and I think that's key, and we all have that same passion. And then the Voice Referendum and what's happening now, and then resources and any questions you have. I'm going to play a video now. It has a bit of, it only goes for about 6 minutes, but it does have a bit of context on where Voice Treaty Truth came from. So let me know if there's any sound technical difficulties, but it should be all good.
I think the messaging from the Uluru Convention is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are going to take control back of this recognition process. I think what we heard from all the dialogues was overwhelmingly universal, in that people wanted the tools to make an actual difference to their lives on the ground. We distilled all of the information that the 13 dialogues gave us and came out with a model that involved treaty making, a voice to the Parliament, and a truth commission.
We cannot continue to go on anymore being voiceless and powerless in our own lands. So far, we don't have any say in any legislation, any policy at all. So from here, what we're saying to Australia is this relationship between us, this very poor relationship, full of rampant racism and what have you, has to stop. The country has to be mature and sophisticated enough to have an intelligent conversation so we can all move forward and solve this unfinished business between us all, because it's definitely time.
People want to make sure the truth is never forgotten, and that we as Australians, we can talk truthfully about the past. We should never let the past be a burden upon us, but at the same time, it will always be a burden if we don't face up to it. And denial is no solution to that burden. In fact, the weight of that burden increases the more determined we are to try and force a denial and a forgetfulness about it. So one of the really strong messages from all of the dialogues, but emphasised here this week, was that the First Nations want our own people and the rest of Australia to engage in a process of truth-telling, a lot like other societies that have been racked by division and the wounds of the past. A lot of other societies have established truth-telling processes to lay the groundwork for a more united future. And this is what people have done here this week.
In my work as a United Nations expert, I've been able to look across, the 70 countries of the United Nations who have significant Indigenous populations and see that kind of voice to the Parliament, that kind of parliamentary institution is quite a conventional way that member states accommodate Indigenous peoples within the state. So it's no surprise to me that has come up as a significant legal reform option for communities who feel like they don't have any power and they don't have any voice. And what we did hear from the dialogues right around the country is a very strong sense of powerlessness and voicelessness. People feel they don't have community control anymore. They feel like their communities are run from Canberra. And I think that's a really important message for the Prime Minister and opposition leader to hear, that communities feel so profoundly unhappy with the way Aboriginal polities are situated and located within the life of the Australian state.
There's heaps of overlap, heaps of common ground, heaps of common themes. And of course, the consensus was around us calling for a voice to Parliament, constitutionally mandated. It is a substantial proposal. It's a critically important proposal. And the message that came out of the dialogues was unanimous on this. And it was confirmed as the priority. But the hopes of our people are that it will be this voice that sets up the next stage of our movement towards agreement making under a Makarrata Commission. The old idea of a Makarrata is more than 30 years old. It's a well-established idea, the Uluru name for people coming together after a disagreement. And so the concept of the Makarrata has been re-invoked in our struggle. And where the Uluru statement says that one of the functions of the Voice to Parliament is to advocate with government the establishment of a Makarrata Commission to supervise agreement making between First Nations and governments.
So yeah, that was just a bit about voice, treaty and truth and where it has come from. Over the last decade of work on constitutional recognition of First Peoples, there's been, I think, it's been 13 years, 8 processes and 11 reports. This has been I won't go through all the reports and bore you with that information, but all of the reports are actually on our website as well, ulurustatement.org. So yeah, I think, you know, we've gone through these processes before, and the concept of the voice isn't new. We've been doing it since colonization as well. So it's really key to know the background to how we got here to voice treaty truth. So as you saw in that video, the Uluru Statement calls for and was issued to the Australian people in 2017. And it calls for, firstly, a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice to Parliament, and secondly, a Makarrata Commission to supervise agreement-making processes, so treaties between First Nations peoples and government, and the truth-telling processes. I think I want to note about the sequencing as well. A lot of the, in the regional dialogues, treaty and I think voice to Parliament was pretty unanimous voice to Parliament was unanimous across all of the regional dialogues. Treaty came second and sometimes came second last in a lot of the regional dialogues. I'll talk more about the options, but there were options on the table that people wanted to do within their community, whether that was a voice to Parliament, treaty making, removing, I think, Section 126, and obviously I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a constitutional expert, but being around lawyers 24/7 in my job, you learn a bit, and Kim can also talk to that as well. But yeah, so I think it's really key to know that it's not that we don't want treaty at all. That is the process. So we're going for a voice to Parliament because it's at a federal level, and then treaties in all states and territories, and then that truth-telling process, which is overarching both reforms. So yeah, we're not forgetting about treaty. It's just the sequencing. Here's a regional dialogue. So this is on our website too. We held 13 regional dialogues, including one in Canberra, and then the big constitutional convention in Uluru. So at these regional dialogues, it was over a couple of days, I think 2 or 3 days. They were all held by the land councils. And so the referendum committee went around Australia the referendum committee was made up of, I think, 16 Indigenous and non-Indigenous members, including our very own Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Allira Davis. They chose to go around and consult First Nations mob on what they wanted, what they see constitutional reform being, and how we can impact change within our communities at a very substantive way and structural way as well. So it's it's a substantial change and structural reform for our communities. I just want to note that no one was banned from the dialogues. The process was very robust and had robust discussions. Those in attendance were deliberately made up of 60% of First Nations traditional owner groups, 20% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations, and 20% for key individuals. Youth participation and gender balance were really important as well to consider in those who were invited to participate. These delegates were, as I said, were asked about what meaningful constitutional reform meant to them. Because I know there's some misinformation out there that some people were banned. That's not true. But also the process after the voice gets enshrined into the Constitution, there's going to be more consultation. So trying to include, everyone. But this process was a first for First Nations consultation. Here's just a bit of visual context on what the dialogues look like. So in the rooms, there was, as I said, those 60% of traditional owner groups, community-controlled organisations, and key individuals. This was really, I think, just as I said, the largest First Nations consultation process in Australia. And there was, constitutional lawyers in the room, but when mob had to speak and want to speak, they'd have a safe space where, non-Indigenous people would step out, and it would just be mob only talking about, I guess, the truth-telling aspect too, because, there's a lot of trauma in our country, and there's a lot of history in our country. And I think this process was one of its kind, and having to be aware of that and recognize the history that has gone on and the genocide that's gone on in this country is really, really key, and taking people's feelings and emotions into that as well, but doing this in a very strategic and intelligent way. I was a part of I don't know if you can see me, but I was a part of the Brisbane dialogue. I think I was only like a 20 or 21-year-old, and I just thought it was the coolest process ever. It was just in awe. And this is the First Nations National Constitutional Convention held in Uluru. I think it's we actually went back for the 6th anniversary. We went back to Uluru. And I think it was very surreal and beautiful because it kind of, kicked us into gear a little bit. We've been working so hard over the last 6 years to continue this and build the momentum. And I think one key thing that I always listen to Auntie Pat and Prof, when Malcolm Turnbull rejected the statement or the Uluru statement, they've just taken no for a yes. And they've just kind of kept going, and people would always say no to them. ScoMo didn't want to listen to us. So they would okay, we're just going to continue, keep pushing. And to be honest, I think they've played a big part in us getting to where we are today, and getting to a referendum. I'll just show you a bit about the Uluru Youth Dialogue, what we do. So we're made up of over I think 40 First Nations young people around the country. That photo, the big photo in the middle, that's our first Uluru Summit we held in Cairns in December 2019, talking about the Uluru Statement, its reforms, legal aspects, political strategy, structural change, and then also had a keynote speaker, George Megalogenis, who spoke about the demographics of Australian society and where the no and yes votes are. This is my co-chair, Bridget Dharma. She's a Pacifica Fijian woman, Wiradjuri woman as well. And I met her earlier that year in 2019, and we kind of just bonded over this reform, and now she's been one of the bestest colleagues I've ever worked with, and privileged to do this journey with her. So here's some of our activations. So Yarbin Day, Splendor in the Grass. I mean, if you've seen the news last year, it was very muddy and a bit traumatic for our youth, but they were just happy to be there. We've done the Midnight Oil concerts, the Desert Song Festival, NRL All Stars, a social media takeover. So taking advantage of that social media lens is really key to us, especially as young people. I mean, we're on it 24/7. So I think, you know, having an impact on there really helps our campaign and helps this movement. And then, yeah, here's some of our team, which is, I think is really cute. I mean, we're just young people who just really want to make change and keep fighting the good fight of our elders and our ancestors. So now to kind of the nitty gritty, the voice referendum and what's happening now. So as you know, ALP commitment to the Uluru Statement in full. I think it was Anthony Albanese's first two lines. He said, I support the Uluru Statement in full, and Uluru Statement from the heart in full. And I think it was very surreal. We were all on a text chain with my team, and I was actually celebrating a friend's birthday, and yeah, we were just all gobsmacked and just really, really surreal moment. And now we're going to a referendum, and I think that's really, really, really nerve-wracking, but also exciting for our people because change is coming and history is calling. We have the final referendum question and final constitutional amendment, the design principles, and then what is the constitution referendum process? We just put this in our presentations because sometimes some people don't know we have a constitution, or if you're not around it 24/7, you know, you kind of need to explain, I guess, the civics education piece as well. Here would be the question. So a proposed law to alter the constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? So fun fact, you will have to actually write yes or no. It's not a tick in the box. You have to write it. We're actually recognising that some people's first languages aren't English or can't write in English, I guess. So we've recognised that process, and we're trying to get into communities and practice that as well to help the vote. Here's a constitutional amendment. I'm sure Kim can talk more about this. I'm not, as I said, not a constitutional expert, but yeah, obviously we need to know this about our jobs. And the final constitutional amendment was confirmed by Parliament through the Constitutional Alteration Bill on the 19th of June, 2023. And I was actually in the Senate House when that was passed. And I just hugged Professor Megan Davis and Auntie Pat Anderson because, yeah, once again, very surreal moment. I think just being involved in this as a young person too is, especially so early in my career, I'm just so grateful and privileged to be around such strong Indigenous leaders in our country. So here's our design principles. As I said before, the process of the voice is enshrining it first and then talking about the model after, because if we have a permanent model that we have to stick to, I mean, we can't really go back and change what we've said. So we're in a really good position. And I think shout out to Prof and Auntie Pat for standing by the mandate of what the mob wanted and what the mob called for in the dialogues. They really helped with the question and the amendment and really pushed for making sure it is will be substantial and, will be structural reform within our communities. Happy to answer any questions about the design principles, but these were created by the Referendum Advisory Group. So when Albanese announced the government was going to a referendum, Australia was going to a referendum, Minister Linda Burney created these two groups, the Referendum Advisory Group and the Engagement Group, who helped with the questions amendment, but the group advised the government on how to hold a successful referendum. So these principles were developed by First Nations Referendum Group, endorsed by the Australian government. So it gives you an overview of what the voice will look like. And a lot of questions ask about the representation of the voice. So as you can see here in the bottom left corner, the voice will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, gender balance, and include youth. So I think just noting that we're giving the voice back to the voiceless, or giving the voice to the voiceless. So making sure that the people who are impacted by these things and by the injustices that we experience daily in our communities will have the voice to take it up and have a seat at the table. And obviously the process will still be spoken about afterwards, after the voice is enshrined. But it was created like that so that we give grassroots communities the opportunity to have a say, because they're the experts in our communities. So I've just got a couple more slides left just about our strong continued community support. So as I said, this is one of its kind processes. 83% of First Nations peoples do support the voice. Not all Blackfellas are going to agree on everything. Not all non-Indigenous people agree on everything. So I think it's good to have that healthy discussion and constructive discussions around what it's going to look like, how it's going to be. Some people won't vote. Well, they'll easily vote no just because of different reasons. People think that we'll cede our sovereignty within, if we sign over to the Crown, but we won't cede our sovereignty. We hold our sovereign rights within ourselves. And we didn't cede our sovereignty in 1967, and we didn't cede our sovereignty at the Marlborough decision, and we will not cede our sovereignty now. Within treaty processes, however, sovereignty will be negotiated, because treaty processes are agreement making, and you have to have some sort of negotiation or something to give back in that process. What is the Constitution? I'm sure Kim will talk more about this, so I won't talk about it too much, but it's our country's guiding document, what we follow by. So yeah, we're not actually recognised, and we're the only country who doesn't recognise our First Nations people in any form or shape or form. So yeah, it's kind of sad, because we are the oldest, longest surviving culture on Earth, but that's what we're fighting for today. I think this is a good slide to know just about the referendum process, how to change the Constitution. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, but I think there's been 46 or 48 referendums, and only 6 have been...
Other way. I think there are 8 that have been passed.
8 that have been passed, yes, sorry. I need to do my research more, but yeah, I think it's just interesting that our most successful was the 1967 referendum, and that was to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were considered as human beings. So because before that we were considered as flora and fauna. Yeah, so both houses have passed the bill, and then the yes and no cases have come out. Yes campaign came out, I think, in February, and then the no campaign came out a little bit after that. The AEC will send out pamphlets explaining both yes and no cases. I think it's interesting to know, though, that within those pamphlets, they don't get fact check at all. There is no oversight of fact checking the yes and no cases, case pamphlets that will be sent to all Australians. So we really encourage Australians to ensure they research and not believe everything they read on social media or in the media. So I think that's really a key thing to know. And then we go to a referendum. Proposed date, we've got a little bet going on in our in our team that, you know, Anthony Albanese might hold it after the NRL grand final, because he's a big South Sydney fan, but I don't think South Sydney will get into the grand final, but don't tell him that. Yeah, so hopefully, I think the proposed date will be early October, mid-October. So, but don't quote me on that. And then the Australian Constitution can only be changed with the support of a majority of Australian voters and majority of voters in majority of states. Territory votes only count towards the national majority. Then we have our resources. So please, if you need any other information, please go to our website. It has amazing resources, FAQs, translations. We actually have, I think, 62 international translations in different languages. And you can actually hear it too, which is really, really cool. Talking about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We have supporter kits, images, social media tiles, and we encourage people to write to your local MP on why you support the Uluru Statement from the Heart and of First Nations Western Parliament. And then you can sign up to our, or if you know any youth or young people within your area who want to get involved, we do have an Uluru Youth Network that's for any cultures to join any young person between the age of 18 to 30. We want to bump it up to 35, but I think that might be a bit of a process too. But yeah, I think I just want to finish off is, you know, we're going to hear a lot of misinformation in the next couple of months, but just know that this process is one of its kind, and the leaders behind it are one of the, I stand in the energy and awe of greatness when I'm around Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis and our team, the Uluru Dialogue. But we just need to make sure that we get informed and have conversations. It's those dinner table conversations. It's the conversations that you have in your work, community groups, and making sure that, you know, you just bring it up, say, hey, have you heard about the Uluru Statement from the Heart? And that conversation goes from there, because we have the right and the privilege to vote. And I think, you know, that's powerful in itself. But yeah, thank you all for listening. Sorry, I might have gone a little bit over time, but I think it's really key just to know all the information, because yeah, it's pretty difficult when you see stuff online and you know, things are gone or taken out of proportion, and you kind of just don't you don't want to engage, but you also want to make sure that everything's factually correct, because this day and age, it's kind of like, you know, everyone will see something and believe it straight away. So, I mean, we've experienced it with COVID, and I think that's just an example of how misinformation is dealt with. But yeah, let me know.
Allira, thank you so much. You have been fantastic. But we're not going to take questions now because we want to hear from Kim first. Please write your questions in the chat for Danielle, and we're going to turn our attention now to Kim. Thank you, Allira. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, National Council of Jewish Women, for inviting me and Allira to speak tonight. I'm actually I think I might be the only person, I'm not the only person here in Canberra. I've got family also here in Canberra who are tuning in, but I come from the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri country, and I'm honoured to be sitting not far from Parliament House, where the Constitutional Alteration Bill was passed just a couple of weeks ago. And by virtue, as Allira said, of that being passed, not earlier than 2 months from the date of that bill passing, and not later than 6 months. So we know by, I think it was the 20th of June, the bill passed the Senate, by the latest, the 20th of December this year. But as Allira was indicating, the likelihood is more predicted to be around October or November. Each person on the electoral in this country will have a duty to vote at this referendum. And I'm very excited as an Australian constitutional lawyer to be speaking to you tonight about your role in this journey, all of us, in terms of our responsibility as citizens in Australia to not only respond to the Uluru Statement from the Heart's call to join with Indigenous Australians in this journey, but also in terms of a journey of Australian constitutional law. And in many ways, part of why I'm very excited about this process is that I believe it's an opportunity for all of us to re-engage with the Australian Constitution as a foundational document of our everyday lives. There is just so much about the Constitution that impacts on what you and I do. And we saw that in really extreme terms during COVID, with borders being closed, with Australian citizens finding it very difficult who were stranded overseas to come back into this country. All of those decisions were ultimately regulated and impacted by the nature of our Constitution. And one of the themes that I'm wanting to impress in the 10 minutes or so I'll spend now, because I'd really like to open it up to questions so people can feel entirely comfortable to ask absolutely anything without any expectation whatsoever, just so that you really understand this process. But I'm hoping that this year will enable people to better understand that the Constitution is actually in need of change. And this is the first and most important step in constitutional change, that of reconciliation and dealing with a constitutional structure that right from the very beginning specifically discriminated against Indigenous Australians. Not only did not recognise, but in non-recognition also specifically discriminated against Indigenous Australians. So my talk is going to begin by a little bit of constitutional history. Then I'm going to pick up on questions of citizenship, which I think are key to both that constitutional history, but the importance of the Uluru Statement itself and also this referendum process. And then link back to why this actual proposal is such a sound, robust and constitutionally secure step, and one that I think we're all privileged to be a part of. So part one, some constitutional history. We are all women sitting in this room. You've just listened to a very inspiring young Indigenous woman speak to us, and you're hearing from a slightly older Indigenous Jewish woman speaking to you. Our voices might have been around in the 1890s, but they were certainly not part of the public discussion in a formal sense. In fact, it was only women in South Australia who had the ability to have some influence on the Australian Constitution's wording. In fact, an inspiring woman whom more people should know of, Catherine Helen Spence, actually put her hand up to run to be one of the drafters of the Australian Constitution. And she was identified as being one of the 10 best men who could be elected. And they put it as 10 best men because it was a bit uncertain, even though she could vote in the state, whether she had a right to be a representative in a federal institutional sort of setting. So she wasn't actually elected, but she and other women in South Australia did actually have an influence. And in fact, they had an influence on this document, the Australian Constitution, because Section 41 actually is a section which protects those women, and in fact, they were the women that they were advocating for's right to vote. And in fact, it was part of a move towards universal suffrage. So just very briefly, Section 41 in here tells us that no adult person who has or acquires a right to vote at elections for the more numerous houses of the state, while that right continues, be prevented by any law of the Commonwealth from voting at elections for either house of the Parliament. In other words, those South Australian women said, we're not going to support federation if we're going to lose our right to vote. And moreover, we want all women to have the right to vote. And ultimately, in 1902, the Commonwealth Electoral Act was changed to enable those women to vote. But interestingly, and this reflects on the second part of my discussion, when that act was introduced, it specifically excluded Indigenous and non-white women from the federal Commonwealth vote. And that's the other part of the story in terms of the framing of the Constitution in the 1890s. Each of the different colonies came together to create this single document, and there were several motivations for doing that. One was there was a lot of economic discussion. Should we have free trade or should we be protectionist? And so that was one of the ideas behind it, to create a uniform economic system. But I would argue that the more pressing reason for the states coming together to create a single nation was because each of them had different immigration restriction acts, and the White Australia policy underpins this document. And they realised that if one state was slightly more lenient in their non-white immigration policy, then it would make it difficult for them to all have such a strong and exclusive Immigration Restriction Act. And in fact, one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the Commonwealth government was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. And together and linked in with that motivation was a decision not to include a head of power over citizenship. So one of the other aspects of our federal system is that it was creating both the federal body to make power, the Commonwealth, but the states would continue to have power to make laws in relation to everything that was in the list of Section 51. So there was a discussion, should there be a head of power? They specifically discussed, should we have a head of power over a Commonwealth citizenship? And ultimately, one of the framers of the Constitution, someone who everyone in this room's name will be familiar with, Sir Isaac Isaacs, one of the Jewish framers of the Constitution, actually said this will lead to innumerable difficulties if we include citizenship in the Constitution, because it means we'll have to be more explicit about the immigration restriction policies. Because, of course, all of those individuals at the time were British subjects. They weren't Australian citizens. And what would they do with those British subjects from India or those British subjects from Hong Kong who they didn't want to allow in to this Commonwealth nation? So they left out citizenship altogether. And in doing that, there was an aliens and naturalisation power that became the power to define who we are. Australians are defined by who we are not, as in aliens, rather than who we are. Now, bundled up with that history is, of course, the treatment of First Nations, Aboriginal people at that time, who, under the previous section, which was repealed in 1967, were specifically identified as not being counted for the purposes of Section 7 and 24, which are the sections that set up our system of representative democracy. And whilst that section was repealed in 1967, the reality is that the structures of our underlying constitutional document have never properly taken Indigenous Australians into, in its fullest sense, a full and equal citizenship. They may have been formally British subjects and Australian citizens, but throughout Australian history, they have been discriminated against. And in fact, it wasn't until 1962 that Indigenous Australians were included on the Commonwealth Electoral Act. Now, many people will say, well, now formally Indigenous Australians are formal citizens and there are no explicit discriminatory provisions. But the reality is that there is a big difference between formal citizenship and substantive citizenship. And the reality of the history in terms of the closing of the gap and so forth is that we have not, as a nation, come to terms with and properly engaged with the voices of Indigenous Australians. So one of the aspects of this proposal that I think is so profound is that it's not altering the other aspects of our constitutional document in terms of representative democracy. It's not creating a separate system of representative democracy, but rather enhancing representative democracy by enabling all of us to see a voice which will actually better represent the needs of what is a very vast Indigenous community, not a homogenous Indigenous community. And so one of the, I think, really significant aspects of the voice and the principles that Allira put up in terms of what will come next after the referendum, which is a separate piece of legislation to set up the voice, but it is motivated by a desire to provide for the breadth of Indigenous Australians' voices to be heard, and in a way that is distinctive from what has been happening up until now, which is that each successive government has hand-chosen those Indigenous representatives it wants to hear from, and not necessarily from the breadth of the Indigenous community, and in a way which is not necessarily transparent. Whereas one of the other positives for our system of representative democracy about the voice is that all Australians will be able to hear what the voice is advising both the Parliament and the Executive. And so it makes government decision-making much more transparent for each of us as citizens to determine if we think our elected representatives are doing a good enough job. So in that sense, the idea of our voice fits in very much to enhancing our system of representative democracy. But to go back to that notion of citizenship, and the second part of what I wanted to talk about in terms of our constitutional structure not having an actual reference to citizenship, is that we have relied on active citizenship as a way for all of us to be involved in our governance, and in ways that sometimes we see works effectively and other times perhaps less so. But ultimately, the referendum process requires each of us to be involved. And what I think was particularly powerful about the process that Allira just explained to us of the Uluru Statement from the Heart was that desire by Indigenous communities to go around the entire country and engage with Indigenous communities. There were 13 regional dialogues, and at each of the regional dialogues, the participants engaged with this document and asked one another, what do we want as a community from this document? It's something that all of us should be asking to this very day. And in fact, one of the gifts, not only of the voice as an addition to enhancing our democracy, is the way in which I hope it will encourage all of you to think about how there are other aspects that are really important about changing this constitution. Because the reality is that when it was framed in the 1890s, lots of different communities' voices weren't heard, and we've evolved as a society to be a much richer and multicultural society, and there are aspects of this constitution that don't take that into account enough, and there are ways of changing it. So there are different aspects of our constitution that are in need of change, but what better way to start in terms of addressing that as all of us as citizens of thinking, is this document really standing up to the test of time, is to start with one of those foundational questions where it clearly hasn't stood to represent the values of a society that wants reconciliation. So section 128, just to take us back to the beginning, because I really do want to allow us to have the time for a question or two, because I can see we're close to the end, is to say that section 128 also mirrors that historical provision that I told you about. There is a paragraph there that says, until there is universal suffrage, only half of the counts will vote in those states that held universal suffrage. So those women of the 1890s are in the section that is directing our referendum, section 128. Thankfully, in 1902, that changed. But ultimately, there was a discussion at the Constitutional Conventions. Should women's votes go in pink and be identified that way? And ultimately, they said, no, only half will count. Luckily, not only half will count around the states, although of course, the ACT and the Northern Territory only do count half of the process, but ultimately we need to ensure that, as Allira set out, section 128 requires a majority of people in a majority of states. So every single person here has a role and a responsibility between now and the referendum to inform themselves. And I hope that this little bit of constitutional history helps you understand that the structural underpinnings of our constitution require, in my view, change to not only recognise First Nations, but also to listen to the request that came out of such a productive citizenship process, one that has been affirmed finally by constitutional lawyers around the country as being sound, because it purely sets up the body to advise Parliament and the Executive, and is back in the hands of our Parliament, our representatives, to actually then determine the makeup of that body. And I think that also is not only consistent with a constitution that just sets up the structures, but also is consistent with the need for the reality that in 100 years' time or even sooner, there might be tweaks and changes that are needed to that body to better represent the needs of that community at that time. And so that both commitment to having a voice is so important, but also the flexibility to allow our representatives, who we will continue to vote in, to determine the exact structure and framework. And those guiding principles that Allira showed you will no doubt guide this government in what it proposes, but ultimately it will be our parliament that finalises the very structure of that voice. And that, again, is consistent with representative democracy. So in that way, I think we are getting the best of both worlds, a really important step that doesn't revolutionise or undermine our current structures, but enhances them in a way that we all, I think, in our hearts can really affirm the importance of reconciliation and moving forward in a positive way for the future of all of us as Australians. Thank you.
Wow, Kim, thank you so much. And I'm sure we've got a big wave of hands out there, but of course no one's going to actually do it because it will be disruptive. So before, I want to just ask everybody's indulgence that we actually carry through till 9:30. I know that some of you will have to go earlier, but we are on 9 o'clock and it would be really a shame to not have the conversation, because conversation is so important. So I apologise to those who have to leave, but that's what we're going to continue to do. Before I hand over to Danielle to manage the question process, I just want to comment a little bit myself about what we've heard this evening. The first thing is, it seems that as women, we really have an additional obligation to vote yes here, because it will be a matter of us then taking the bull by the horns and saying, this constitution of ours needs shaking up. It's needed shaking up. Who's known that most? Well, women from the beginning. We weren't even there most of the way, and Kim's taught us some small part of the story. So it's about time, 100 plus years later, maybe we women need to take it on and take it on as our constitution, as our document that defines who we are as a people. And that obviously has to recognise and include Indigenous people, First Nations people. It must include people who are here first, and they need to be included as equal partners in the venture. And what better way to do it than to start the experiment with the new sort of constitution we might be moving towards with the voice. So that seems to me to be one stream that we have going. Another stream came from what Allira was saying, and it was sort of a bit of subtext, because although the pictures on the screen showed quite a lot of men and we heard men's voices, what I was hearing was about the women. There kept on being women in leadership in that community who were saying, we've left it going too long like this. We've tried, our leaders have tried, of course, all the time. It's not that Indigenous people have done nothing in all these years. Of course, there's been crying out. But the women are saying, this has been going on for too long. People keep on saying they're closing the gap. So how come there's such a big gap? What does it mean to close a gap if my child's education is still so much poorer than it should be? If I don't have access to proper health? If the whole penal system and justice system has so much injustice in it for me and my people? And so we're seeing women taking the lead here. And what the Indigenous women are telling us is that we need to accept this voice to Parliament, because it's an idea that's come from the whole of the Aboriginal community. It's an idea that's come from such a wide consultation, and it's an idea, therefore, that must be worth a go. Constitutional law has always been an experiment of sorts. A constitution's always been an experiment. Why not start this constitution the way women want to do it? So, Danielle, can I pass over? Sorry, I couldn't resist the opportunity to just make those observations. But perhaps there might be some questions that Danielle has got. And also, of course, you can raise your hand. And if you do, we'll see you. But it's much easier if you let Danielle know if you've got a question so she can get onto you. Danielle.
Thank you very much. And thank you both, Kim and Allira. It's been an honour to hear from both of you this evening. And I personally have learned a lot, so I hope the rest of our audience has as well. I have some questions, and I've already got one person with their raised hand, and feel free to raise your hand if you have further things. The first question that I'm going to ask, and it's for both of you, I'm not sure who wants to answer it. Is there any obligation for Parliament to act on recommendations by the Voice?
Allira, do you want me to start and then you add?
Yeah, you go, yeah.
So ultimately the answer is no, that it doesn't necessarily have to take the advice of the Voice. But ultimately, and so some people would say, well, then how is that going to make any difference? But I think the point that I was trying to emphasize in my discussion was that by having a body like this, it will be a body that not only is advising the Parliament and the Executive, but as the citizenry, we will know of what it is saying. And so if a government decides not to follow, and it might for what might be deemed legitimate reasons, the recommendations, all Australians will be aware of that. It will be much more transparent, and it will be something upon which we can then judge whether we think that government made the right decision or not in terms of following the Voice's recommendations. So the creation of the advice has no veto power. So it's not as if it's forcing the government to act, but it is a process in which it will enhance the capacity of Parliament and the Executive to take the advice into account in making decisions. And as a matter of process, as an administrative lawyer, that is something that we've always talked about with students as enhancing the process, because the more relevant information that you have in making a decision, you hope the better the decision will be. So I think that's in essence the answer from my perspective. But Allira, you might have something else you want to add.
No, I think I'm echoing just with previous reports that have come out, like deaths in custody as well, the recommendation into the recommendations into the removal of children within our communities as well. So a lot of those reports will be at a high level, but the experts obviously will be able to put those, because those recommendations actually haven't been implemented at all, and we're, I think, now over 500 who have experienced deaths in custody. So it is pretty traumatic, and I think it's really key to implement these changes within our communities. But I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. The next question is, we're a group of women, or about women, is what difference will the Voice make to Indigenous women? For example, will it help with issues around things like domestic violence within the Indigenous community? Or is it an adjunct?
So I might just add one thing, Allira, before you perhaps have some more substantive stuff. But as a matter of process, one of the design principles is, of course, the equal involvement of women in the Voice. So it's starting off already from a better standing position in terms of the lived experience of women being equally a part of the Voice structure, which of course is something I think our Parliament could be improved in that respect as well. But so by having that commitment to women's involvement in a leadership and governance sense will in and of itself improve the breadth of that experience being woven into decision making. And over to you, Allira.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, I'm all for women. I'm a young Black woman myself. And I think, as I said before in my presentation, Professor Megan Davis and Auntie Pat Anderson have been monumental in this process, and very, as I said, they don't take no for an answer. So we will continue as women to stand up for what's right, and make sure that our voices are heard, and especially I think within domestic violence or single moms, that will all be at the table. Those discussions will be at the table. I mean, you can just look at the Closing the Gap report as well. We've only met 4 of the 19 targets, and it's been 10 years, or over 10 years, sorry, since it was implemented. And I'm not saying women run the country, but I mean, obviously a man runs the country, but I mean, we have a very, very unique experience and those lived experiences as well. So if it wasn't, Barney Patton professor to keep pushing, I don't think, I would even have the courage to do this, but I think, we'll definitely be represented in that sense.
Thanks. I'm actually going to add Amanda to our answer for the second, because Amanda is a psychologist, and we'll hear her opinion also on how this could impact.
Thanks, Danielle. This isn't just opinion. This is a lot of work has been done in this area. And we know that because of the undermining of voice, if you like, lack of legitimacy and self-esteem, Indigenous people have lost to some extent their way within family, and this is going to make an enormous difference to the status of men by women having this say as well. So when we help the men in their families and the women in their families, it is going to eventually support better engagement between the genders, and that's very significant in terms of the amount of domestic violence. So we know that it will make a difference in a sociological and a psychological way to what is going on, without it being that the voice is making demands. It's saying, not only are you not flora and fauna, you are the core members of our society. You are the First Nations, and we have respect for you. That's what the voice is saying. And allowing people to feel that sense of self is going to make a difference to the way they behave towards each other as well as towards us. So it's going to make a big difference.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm going to ask one more question that I've got in the chat, and then I'm going to call on Karen Cutler, who has her hand raised. And then I've got more questions in the chat, unless other people would like to raise their hands. So this is actually one I've heard a lot in the last sort of 48 hours, and quite an important one is lots of people are saying that the voice is racist almost. Like, why a First Nations voice, not a voice for other disadvantaged groups? So how can we go out and counter this statement?
So this is something that I've written quite a bit about and it builds on that starting point that I discussed, which is that the presumption there is that we're dealing with a document that treats both the Australian Constitution and our whole governance structure in a way with all of us equally. And the reality is, as I tried to explain, is that the document was set up to do the opposite, to enable discrimination in a very overt way. And that was specific in relation to non-white Australians, but in particular, the impact on First Nations is profound. And so this is essentially a recalibration to enable Indigenous Australians to be treated equally and in a way that further affirms their long-standing and pre-existing sovereignty. So they are distinct and different by virtue of that sovereignty. But this is, as I said, quite an ingenious way of not only recognising that, but recalibrating a document that is out of whack to enable them to be treated substantively equally. And sometimes I use the example, and most people who know me will know that I'm not one of the tallest people in the world. But if a group of people were each given the same ledge to stand on to look over a fence, and we're all given that same equal opportunity, the formal equal opportunity being the fence, me as the shortest person is not likely to see over the fence necessarily just because we've all been given the same starting point. And the reality is that Indigenous Australians have been specifically discriminated against in such a way that their disadvantage is profound. And so this is a stool in a way to provide them with an equality that has not been there. So it's not racist. In fact, it's actually a framework to enable us to overcome the racism that is inherent in the Constitution.
Mic drop. I think that was a very, I don't know if I have anything to add. I think maybe I'll just add the fact that, we have, that spiritual notion and that spiritual connection to this land. And the history and the facts and the evidence as well, that we've been here for more than 60,000 years. The voice is not racist. It's not divisive at all. We are 3% of the population, but we do need the 97% to walk with us. And I think, I think just with some of the no campaign messaging as well, our Uluru dialogue isn't about forcing people to vote yes. It's about informing and educating Australians as much as possible. So when people do get into that ballot box, they will make that informed and conscious decision, rather than listening to, people say, oh, the voice is racist or it's divisive. So making sure that we're informing and educating as much as possible. But I think Kim said it perfectly, so I'm going to stop talking.
No, thank you. Then we have another question that is probably more for Allira, which is about the history of the Referendum Council. When was it established, by whom? And obviously for us, what was the female representation in that? Were female voices heard just as much?
Yeah, so the Referendum Council was created under the Malcolm Turnbull government to go out to communities and mobs to ask them what constitutional reform looked like to them. And the Referendum Council was made up of 16 not Indigenous and non-Indigenous members. Mark Liebler, Murray Gleeson, Noel Pearson, Tanya Hosh, Amanda Vanstone, Dallas Yorkston, and God rest his soul, Golari Unipingu. You can get more information on our website, but as previously mentioned, it was established by the Turnbull government with support of Shorten. Opposition leader following the issuing of the Kirribilli statement by 40 First Nations leaders who called for a proper consultation with First Nations people and asking, as I said, what constitutional recognition looks like to them, and striking down any form of symbolic constitutional recognition, because in previous years we didn't, for example, the Recognise campaign was a symbolic form of constitutional recognition. Enshrining the voice into the Constitution is a form of substantial change and structural reform. So there will actually be actions and we will be able to have a say in the decisions and policies and laws that affect us, as Kim alluded to about advising the Parliament and executive government. Sorry, was there a part 2 to that question? I think I'm missing it.
When it was established.
So 2016. So 2015-16, the Referendum Council did kind of a dummy run of the regional dialogues, and then 2017 they went on their trek, as the Uluru Statement from the Heart says, started their trek across this vast country, and then they started, I think, in Brisbane, I believe. And obviously Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis have kept kept the fire burning and kept it alive. And if you haven't seen Australian Story, I recommend you watch it as well. It's about Professor Megan Davis and her journey. I'm a bit biased because she is my auntie, but I was volunteering for the role for about 4 years, and I was like, I can do this, like I'm ready and passionate, and she saw potential in me. So yeah, if you'll hear about the journey and where it's kind of as she is, you know, an Aboriginal woman and a proud one to be that. So yeah, I think, you know, women in this process will definitely, there will not yeah, Prof and Auntie Pat definitely are very staunch leaders, and always a privilege to be in their aura and their energy all the time. So yeah, Kim, did you want to mention anything else?
I think just to affirm that there has been that commitment throughout this process for women's equal involvement, and as Allira said, very strong women leaders who have been significant throughout. So that, I think, is something that is I think should give us as members of National Council of Jewish Women, and for all men and women, a commitment to equality as being so fundamental to enable that difference of perspective to be brought in to all government and governance frameworks is so profound for us as a society more broadly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I just ask, Allira, can you tell us the name again of the Australian Story? And if somebody who's good at looking things up would like to look it up and put the link in the chat, that would be even better.
Yeah, it's on ABC, but it's on YouTube. I can get it up now and send it through. But
it's available on iView currently.
What's it called?
It's just called Australian Story, and if you
the episode is the specific one, and you'll be able to tell that that's what it is. It has about.
It was just last Monday night.
Yeah.
Okay. So did everyone get that? Last Monday night, Australian Story, and maybe we'll get the link in the chat if we're lucky.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
So just on the back of what Kim was just saying, somebody mentioned in the chat that they attended the opening of the Queensland Holocaust Museum that happened earlier today. And this individual said it was inspiring, the inspiring message that was sent about opposing genocide, and inspiring us all to stand with all those marginalised and discriminated against. And I think for lots of Jews, that's a reason why we believe so strongly in standing with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, because we know what it's like to be a stranger in a strange land, but to be a stranger in your own land must be even more confronting. Another question I have, at the beginning of Allira's presentation, she talked about the fact that Australia was the only country that didn't have a treaty of some sort with their Indigenous people. And this question is actually about what the United Nations has to say about Indigenous people within its member states. So that, I believe that's probably more for you, Kim.
Well, actually, Allira's auntie, Professor Megan Davis, has been the chair of the Permanent Standing Forum on Indigenous First Nations people. And so she is an authority, and I think it very much informed the approach to this whole process of the Uluru Dialogue framework. And there is, and Australia is a signatory to that convention in terms of self-determination and aspects to do with First Nations people. And I think also, as Allira explained, the Uluru Statement, and I'd really encourage every single person in this room, if they have not actually read the whole statement, how inspiring it is and how it draws from international law, as well as drawing from the specific Australian experience, is about providing a framework for representation, which the voice is, but also in terms of treaty and truth-telling. And I've been doing quite a few of these discussions with a colleague of Allira's called James Blackwell, and one of the things that's come up a lot in relation to questions about those Indigenous communities who are not supporting it, or a few of those voices who are getting a lot of media attention, but are part of that, I think 13% or so that, we've given the figures that 86% or so of Indigenous Australians are in support of the voice. Of those who are not, one of the aspects is the order. And as Allira said, the Uluru dialogues determined that the order should be voice, treaty, truth. And some who are resistant to the voice are saying treaty should come first. And treaty is another aspect in relation to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples about the importance of treaty. And again, drawing back from Megan's experience, Professor Davis's experience in comparing different countries and treaties. If we look at New Zealand, for instance, treaty was one of the first steps after the British arrived in terms of an equal sort of footing between the new arrival people who were arriving and the Indigenous populations, so that the process of treaty was on a more equal footing. If you look at what's happening in Canada, for instance, it's taken quite a long time, and in fact it's the Crown or the government that are actually having to represent the Indigenous communities, because the Indigenous communities don't have enough strength in and of themselves to be on a more equal playing field. And the way that it's been shared with me is that the conventions determined that voice needed to come first, so that there was a better framework of governance within Indigenous communities to then lead to treaty, and treaty being agreement making between different nations. And so this has been seen by the majority of Indigenous Australians as a better process towards that step towards treaty and ultimately to truth-telling, if you have a better governance framework for the voices of Indigenous Australians to be shared with those who are in power. So hopefully that's a bit helpful.
Fabulous.
Danielle, there's time for, if you've got one very short question.
I think Allira was about to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Allira went to unmute.
No, all good. No, yeah, I'm happy. Kim's answer was perfectly fine to me.
Thank you. So I'll hand back to Melinda.
Okay, so now I unmuted. What an amazing evening we've had. We've heard so many interesting and new ideas about the voice, about the process, about the Constitution. As I said earlier, this is the most important issue of our time. It's about how we define ourselves. It's how we define ourselves as Jews, how we define ourselves as people, how we define ourselves as a nation. So we're not going to just think that in one evening we can know enough to deal with the process. Danielle has put in the chat for you information about the process, one of the processes with which NCJW is engaged. This is what we're calling Shabbos Table Talks. Now, we're doing this together with 61J and Together Yes. And the Together Yes is an Indigenous community group that has been working on the material. What we've done is developed materials that will be useful for you to get to know better the issues around the referendum. The idea is that you invite some people over. We said Shabbos table dinner because for a lot of us, Friday night's the time we have people over and we're eating. So this was a time we thought it was convenient. But, you know, you can do it around a barbecue. You can do it for afternoon tea. It doesn't have to be Friday night dinner. You invite a few people over, and then you register. And when you register as a host, we will send you material. You will get various things that you will find useful in your conversation. There are things that different people around the table can use. So it's not all on you as the host that you have to be the expert. It doesn't matter whether your knowledge is weak or strong. There'll be enough information for you to be able to run a really fun evening talking about the different issues. So I would recommend that everybody here should do that. I'm certainly doing it because I think it's going to be a lot of fun to take part in the process. So that's the first thing that NCJW are doing, and please look at the link we've got here, which is to shabbostabletalks.com.au. It's pretty easy to remember, shabbostabletalks.com.au. ncjws.com.au, and that's the process that we've got going there. NCJWA has also joined up with a number of organisations, and which is really being led by Stand Up, but a lot of organisations, including the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, are part of the process, and B'nai B'rith, and a few other groups. And the group is called Kol Halev, and the launch of this is happening tomorrow night in Melbourne, if you're in Melbourne, and I think next week in Sydney. So again, if you go to, it seems that the page, it's again in the chat, but you go to Stand Up and then look for Kol Halev. It will tell you about the process. Now that process is going to allow you to become trained to become more involved in the process if you'd like to. There's going to be the possibility of doing old-fashioned campaigning, making phone calls, door knocking, whatever it is that you feel comfortable in doing. Find out about it, because it's something that, this is a whole historic event, you know, when you tell your grandchildren about your life, and, you know, of course I've already got grandchildren, so I'm already going to take my grandchildren along with me, but things they're going to remember are things like this. This is going to be some time where you made a difference to Australian history, and you were part of the process. So take the opportunity, find out more, and if your feeling is no, we respect that. Of course, some people are going to say no, they don't think the referendum's the right thing, and that's quite a legitimate point of view. But you've got to be a citizen of this country, and citizenship involves knowing what is going on, making informed decisions. So please do that, take part in that process. Now, and keep an eye out, because NCJW has got some other projects relating to the voice that are happening over the next couple of months as well. And by the way, National Council of Jewish Women is not only doing work on the voice. This is one of one of the streams, and of course it's going to be our focus at the moment because it's the most important thing happening. But stay tuned. There's likely to be other exciting things happening over the next little while. But please take part in some of these processes. I think you'll gain so much personally by taking part in the conversations, like I'm sure you did tonight. So I think, having got to exactly 9:30 according to my computer, I can say thank you all very much. Thank you particularly to our speakers, who were absolutely wonderful, and we need to give the round of applause. Really fantastic. Wonderful to meet you, Allira. Wonderful to work with you again, Kim. And everybody here, thank you so much for coming and for participating in this important conversation. And good night.